We used to be very bad at drawing dinosaurs. Here's why we were wrong and why the new fossils are savage teachers. Throughout the history of paleontology, which began in the 19th century, our understanding of prehistoric animals has advanced quite a bit. And with that, our artistic renditions of dinosaurs have changed drastically. With each passing decade, they become more and more realistic. But what's really crazy is just how wrong some of these old drawings are. Some dinosaurs that used to be depicted as lumbering lizards are now known to have been fast-moving predators, and some once fierce monsters were probably more akin to birds than crocodiles. Today, we're taking a look at some of the prehistoric animals that scientists got horribly wrong, and we'll see how new fossils have corrected their misconceptions. First, we have to look at this tail-dragging Brachiosaurus. It was first discovered in 1877 by paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope, who had a bit of a rivalry going on with another famous paleontologist, Othniel Charles Marsh. So when Cope found this massive dino, he decided to name it after his rival's daughter, Marsh or Brachio, in order to annoy him. At the time, all they had to work with was a few bone fragments, but they were enough for Cope to reconstruct the skeleton. However, based on what they knew about modern animals and a bit of scientific racism, they imagined it looked like a giant lizard sunning itself on a rock. In fact, Cope even wrote that it walked with its head up in the air and its tail dragging along the ground because, well, that's how lizards do it. The image was cemented in popular culture thanks to the 1933 movie King Kong. Since then, we've all learned that sauropods like the Brachiosaurus were more active and agile than we gave them credit for. For example, according to research published in 2021, they probably didn't drag their tails on the ground because doing so would have been energetically costly. Instead, they probably held their tails off the ground, although whether or not they did so in an elegant fashion like this Brachiosaurus, or with a slight curve like the Dinosaurs would depend on the species. The reason for this is that the way they held their tail would have impacted how much force they could put behind each step. Thus, a perfectly horizontal tail may have helped them get around softer sediments without sinking in. But again, a slight curve might have been better for more powerful strides across rocky terrain. Basically, there's a lot that goes into the way dinosaurs walk. So it turns out that maybe we should have spent less time making them pose like lizards and more time thinking about biomechanics. Speaking of dinosaurs that we got wrong, let's take a look at this Triceratops. This illustration is from 1891, just 4 years after the discovery of the first Triceratops fossil. Back then, the only other horned dinosaurs that we knew of were the Ankylosaurus and the Styracosaurus, both of which were much smaller than the mighty Triceratops. So, given their more diminutive stature, scientists assumed that the huge frills on their heads were likely used for display rather than defense. That is, until they learned about the Pachycephalosaurus, a thick-skulled dinosaur that likely used its head as a battering ram. With that in mind, it seemed pretty clear that the Triceratops's horns and bony frills evolved for fighting. And ever since then, they've been depicted as angry bulls ready to charge. But a new study suggests that the truth is a little more nuanced than that. According to the authors of the paper published in 2021, the shape of the frills and the holes they contained are evidence that they were actually pretty flexible, especially compared to the rigid armor of the Ankylosaurus. Because of this flexibility, the team thinks that Triceratops could move their frills independently of one another and perhaps even control them on an individual scale. The lead author theorizes that they likely used their frills for displays of dominance rather than weapons of war. That said, they also wouldn't have been totally useless in a fight. If the Triceratops got into a scuffle, their frills could still protect them from getting gored in the neck, even if they couldn't use them offensively. After all, Ankylosaurs can't exactly attack first either, but their armor certainly comes in handy when they do get attacked. Either way, I think it's safe to say that Triceratops were more formidable opponents than we previously thought. And who knows, Maybe someday we'll find out that they charged at each other with their horns lowered like mola mola. Next, we have to look at this ferocious T-Rex. This reconstruction was made in 1882 by paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn, and it's one of the first ever made of Tyrannosaurus rex. Mind you, the dino had only been discovered 3 years prior, and back then, all they had to work with were a few teeth, some jaw fragments, and a handful of vertebrae. The rest of the skeleton had to be filled in with educated guesses, and Osborn imagined a large, slow-moving monster that resembled a crocodile. In his original description of the dino, he stated that it was, quote, a type of the lowest and most brutal order of carnivores, and he went on to explain that it was, quote, so ferocious in its habits that it must have been a terror to every living thing. And while Osborn was definitely onto something, we've since realized just how wrong he was. For starters, Tyrannosaurus rex was neither slow nor small. A recent study suggests that they were built for running. And according to one estimate, they could run as fast as 18 miles per hour. Furthermore, they were incredibly massive, growing up to 40 feet long and weighing in at over 8,000 pounds. To put that in perspective, the largest living land predator is the polar bear, which averages around 1,500 pounds. So yeah, the T-Rex was definitely monstrous, but not in the way that Osborn envisioned. And speaking of supersized super predators, check out this megalodon. Megalodon was a 60-foot long shark that lived between 23 and 3.6 million years ago. You may have heard that it was the size of a school bus and had a bite force stronger than any animal that ever lived. But beyond those basic facts, scientists know relatively little about it because it was basically the Loch Ness Monster before the Loch Ness Monster was a thing. People have reported sightings of megalodons for centuries, but most of those stories were dismissed as tall tales. It wasn't until the early 1800s that people started taking them seriously. That's when Swiss geologist Louis Agassiz identified the first megalodon tooth. Initially, he thought it belonged to a whale, but it turned out to be over 7 inches wide. And eventually, he concluded that it must have come from an enormous shark. Like many other prehistoric animals, our depiction of what a megalodon looked like has changed dramatically since then. Early reconstructions showed it as an oversized great white shark, complete with sleek skin and a pointy fin. And while this makes sense given that great whites are huge sharks that occasionally eat people, we now know that this is pretty far from the truth. For starters, the megalodon was more closely related to the whale shark than to great whites. And unlike those speedy hunters, megalodons were filter feeders. They basically swam with their mouths open, filtering plankton and small fish out of the water. We know this because their jaws were lined with thousands of tiny teeth, whereas great whites have just a few dozen large teeth that are perfect for catching and tearing up prey. Another clue that megalodons weren't apex predators is that they had no dorsal fins. And while a lack of fins might make them look goofy, it would have been useful for them. See, when a shark swims, its fins create drag, which is why sharks that swim long distances like the great white have really streamlined bodies and prominent fins. But filter-feeding sharks don't need to swim far to find food. They can stay in one place and passively scoop up all the tasty tidbits floating around them, so they can afford to have less streamlined bodies and smaller fins. Megalodons were the biggest animals to ever swim, and they required a lot of food to stay alive. So, it seems unlikely that they would have wasted energy needlessly cruising around the ocean. No, instead, they probably just hung out close to shore where the water was teeming with food, meaning that they were more like manatees than great whites. Manatees are actually mammals, but the point is that megalodons were probably pretty chill despite their terrifying reputation. Now, obviously, we still have a lot to learn about prehistoric animals. Maybe someday we'll even figure out what this creature is. Just kidding. It's a dinosaur. But hey, even experts get it wrong sometimes. What prehistoric animals do you think we've gotten wrong? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching.